The purpose of this talk is to discuss the global threat of terrorism and the changing tactics that we can expect to see over the next several years. It's altogether fitting, as I thought about it, for us to be doing that today on 19 April. This is the anniversary of the Oklahoma City bombing, okay? In 1995, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols loaded I believe it was a 250-pound ammonium nitrate fuel oil bomb into the back of a moving truck and detonated that outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City. 168 people killed, a good number of which were children from the nursery that was in the ground floor of that building. Almost 700 wounded. An incredible tragedy that took place in retaliation for the federal raid on the Branch Davidian compound that took place on this date in 1993. The unique thing about terrorism, the reality of the world that we live in, is that every day is a memory of something. If we had done this tomorrow, it would be the anniversary of Columbine. If we'd done it earlier in the week, it would have been an anniversary of the Boston bombing. Every day is a memorial to something. That's the reality of the world that we live in, and that world is not changing. And so what we want to look at is really what can we expect from terrorists around the world. And the first point that you have to understand when you're looking at terrorism is that everything is interconnected. Nothing happens in a vacuum. Dr. Supratman and I were talking about this earlier in the morning. And nothing happens in a vacuum. We, in looking at terrorism, could be looking, if we wanted to lay the background thoroughly, we could be looking at everything from military strategy, military tactics, to economic policy, to the municipal social programs in Hamburg, Germany. It all factors in, and for somebody like me who this is kind of a passion, I like getting into those details. For people like you who are here for a class and you're not going to stay beyond that class time, we don't necessarily have the time to dive into all that. So I'm going to try and keep it simple here. But really, before we get started, we want to lay out a little bit of the framework, and you got to understand there are really four broad categories of types of terrorism. We could get into details. There's, if we wanted to, we could list out 26, 27 different types of terrorism, different motivations, tactics, things along those lines that make them unique. But really there are four that we're going to talk about today, two that we're going to spend our time on. The first is jihadi terrorist groups, okay? This is what you typically think of when you think of terrorism. This is Al-Qaeda, the Islamic State. These are groups who are committed to waging jihad against the West. They fight sometimes in the case of the Islamic State over the last couple of years. They use military-like tactics, but at their core they are terrorist groups. The second form is grassroots terrorism. These are people who are self-radicalized. They may have an allegiance to one of those jihadi groups, but they're not working in concert with those terrorist groups. And then you have state-sponsored terrorism. The biggest one that you could point out right now would be Hezbollah. Hezbollah, which is Arabic for the Army of God, or Party of God, are growing by leaps and bounds. They were founded by the country of Iran, and because of in no small part because of the United States policies towards Iran. Iran has a lot of money. A lot of that money is going to Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, consequently, is playing a large role not only in Lebanon, where it's really shaping what that country is going to look like in the future, but also in Syria, where they have thousands and thousands of foot soldiers on the ground. The other thing that we'll spend a little bit of time on is nationalist or separatist terrorism. This would be a version of what Timothy McVeigh tried to pull off in '95. Something where you're trying to establish to right a governmental wrong. You're trying to establish some sort of area of influence for you. And so those are our four that we're going to start off with. We'll spend the majority of the time talking about the jihadi terrorists and the grassroots terrorism, simply because that's what we see the most of today. We also have to understand a good deal about the environment in which those terrorist organizations operate. Okay, the reality for us is that terrorist operating environment has never been more in flux. As a student of history, I'm always hesitant to say that this is the worst it's ever been. It's not the worst it's ever been. I'm not trying to say that. But what I will say is there has never been a time in my understanding where so much has been in flux at the same time. When you look at Eurasia, Europe and Asia, you've got 2 continents, 5 billion people, and literally with the exception of India, every major power in that area is having to deal with at least a systemic issue, if not an existential challenge. Okay? And so nowhere is that more evident than in the Middle East. Okay? We're witnessing a complete collapse of the of the Middle East that Europe created. Many of the countries are undergoing dramatic changes. Some of them, most notably Iraq and Syria, have ceased to exist. I mean, you can still find Iraq and Syria on a map. You can't find it if you go over there. Those countries, as we know them, the borders that they have, you will never see again. Your maps are outdated, and they're not going to come back in style anytime soon. This is largely due to the U.S. Policy of withdrawing from the region. Now, one of the things I want to kind of make a sidebar on here is that from time to time, I'm going to talk about policy, okay? The point of this talk is not to argue this is a good policy or a bad policy, but rather just that every policy has consequences. It can be a good policy and still have bad consequences. And so I'm not trying to make statements about whether it was good or bad, but the U.S. policy was to withdraw from the region. When they did this, it created a massive power vacuum. The U.S. had been the regional kingmaker for decades and decades in the Middle East. And by withdrawing, what they allowed was the most powerful and embittered force in the region to take over, to flood into that vacuum, and that's militant Islam. All right. So the people who are engaging in militant Islam, the borders that were established by Europe, they mean nothing to them. The European borders that were established didn't take into account geography, they didn't take into account tribal allegiances or anything along those lines. And so as that militant Islam floods the region, the borders are going away. So that's the Middle East. Now, taking a look at Europe, Europe, as we know it, is fragmenting. Okay, we've all grown up with the concept of the European Union. Okay, we all know that. We've heard about it for a long time. In 5 years, it won't exist. I mean, I'm not saying it's going to completely collapse, but it's going to be like the League of Nations. People are just going to stop caring that it exists. Okay, already you see countries throughout Europe, throughout the EU, who are wholly throwing out regulations that are demanded by the EU treaties that they've signed. That will continue, and it's for a multitude of reasons. One, that it's always easy to come together and hold hands in brotherhood when everybody's doing well, okay? But when times get hard, when times get lean, people start having areas of disagreement. One of the areas of disagreement has to do with the economy. And I'm not going to get into a lot of detail here, but I think it's important to understand how terrorism is going to operate in Europe. And so let's take a look at it just briefly. The Alps is the mountain range that runs through the EU. South of the Alps, the unemployment rate is 20%. Okay, to put a little bit of perspective on that, 20% unemployment is what the U.S. had during the Great Depression. Okay, north of the Alps, it's a dramatically different picture. Germany, for instance, which has been the engine that has kind of pulled the financial or economic engine that's pulled the EU along, the unemployment rate is at around 4%, which is lower than what we have in the U.S. Those are two very disparate pictures of economies, and you can't force economic regulations equally on both of them. They're just not going to agree to that. And so you will see a lot of fracturing along those lines. You will also see that fracturing in the coming consumer debt crisis. All right. And again, I know you're here to talk about terrorism, or to hear about terrorism, but you've got to understand a consumer debt crisis means a lot of things. You can't have 20% unemployment and not have mortgages falling through. And yet you've seen none of that in the news. Okay, and the reason for that is because it hasn't been announced yet. That's stuff that is coming. And so as Southern Europe really goes through a consumer debt crisis, you have this growing issue of the immigration problem, which is only making things worse. To put it in context, since the beginning of 2016, 170,000 people have immigrated into the EU, which sounds like a big number, but it's really noteworthy from my perspective for two reasons. One is that it's 170,000 since the beginning of 2016, and these are the good weather months, okay? Or I'm sorry, the bad weather months. This is when it's cold. This is when you don't want to cross the Mediterranean. This is when you've really got to push through bad weather to make this happen, and you've already had 170,000 people come in. So that the flow rate is going to increase there. The other reason that it's noteworthy is because the numbers aren't really that big, and Europe still can't handle them. All right, put into perspective, the U.S. in 2014, which is the last year that we have good statistics for, in 2014 we had 1.3 million immigrants. Okay, we had 130,000 from China alone. We had 130,000 from Mexico. We had almost 148,000 from India. Okay, but we can absorb those numbers. Okay, the illegal immigration issue that we have, and I'll get into the details of that a little bit later. The numbers have come down off their peak in 2005. You're not having as great of an influx as there was back in 2005. But Europe just can't handle these numbers. And what this is evidence of is their failed policy of multiculturalism. Okay? Multiculturalism is the idea that you can have multiple distinct cultures living in a confined geographic area. All right? It's the exact opposite of the American melting pot model. Okay? This means that if you're from Pakistan and I'm from China and we both come into the EU, I'm going to go to the Chinese culture, an area where I can speak Chinese and everybody understands me and we can maintain traditional Chinese culture. And you can go to the Pakistani area and speak Urdu and get along well there. All right. But the bottom line is it's a failed policy because you have all these immigrants where in America you spread out to the four winds. You go wherever you want to go. Here, you have an influx of Arabic speakers, and so they have to go to the Arabic-speaking areas. And there's just not the jobs within those small areas. And so it's a failed policy. A lack of language capability means a lack of jobs. A lack of jobs means bitterness. It means isolation. It means disenfranchisement. And it just leads nowhere good. All right. So that, in large part, is Europe. All right. So what's going on with the U.S.? The U.S. We don't have the same problems, but we're trying hard to catch up. All right. That was meant to be a little bit of a joke. Yeah. Thank you. Our economy is sluggish. All right. When you look at the labor participation rate, which is the number of people who are actively engaged, or actively employed, or are actively seeking employment, it's abysmal. Okay. It's as low, it has not been this low since the 1970s, okay? More people are out of the workforce than at any point since the 1970s. But that being said, we're relatively good, okay? Whereas the EU economy is fracturing, our economy is not good, all right? But it's certainly not as good as we would like it to be. We've got problems, but it's nowhere near it has nowhere near the structural issues that our nearest competitors are actively dealing with. And so we're relatively strong. The U.S. does have an immigration crisis, but it's largely a politically manufactured one. I mean, illegal immigration is a problem, but what party's really doing anything about it? I mean, you can blame Obama or you can blame Bush, depending on your perspective, but the reality is illegal immigration is happening, and it's really not having that great of an impact on us from a security standpoint. Now, the economics of it is a different discussion for a different day, but from a security perspective, the threat of illegal immigration is no greater than the threat of legal immigration. Okay, because you're bringing people in, and San Bernardino showed us that. Those were legal immigrants who had come in. And so the illegal immigration problem is largely a politically manufactured one. And the other thing is that we don't have the problem because we are a melting pot, okay? We don't melt as good as we used to, but a melting pot, it's a statement that's made, and I want to spend just a little bit of time discussing what that exactly is. People use that phrase a lot, America's a melting pot. What it means is that we talked about if you're from China, or if I'm from China and you're from Pakistan, we go to our respective communities in Europe. In America, if I'm from China and you're from Pakistan, we have to do business together. We're going to a neighborhood and we both live close to each other. And so if I sell textiles and you sell food, you need my textiles in order to keep your family warm. I need your food in order to keep my family fed. And so we have to come up with a common language. We can't be biased against each other because we need to eat. We need to stay warm. And so those biases melt away. And so we melt, and what used to be ceases to exist, and you become American. Okay? That's a unique thing. All right? I can't go to Nigeria and become Nigerian. All right? Nobody's ever going to look at the white guy from Texas and say, oh, he's Nigerian. It doesn't work like that. You can't do that. I can't go to Britain and I can become a British citizen, but I can't become British. All right? I'm always going to be a Yank with a British passport. All right? But in America, you can come here and you can become American. It's a completely unique thing. And interestingly enough, the reason I want to make the point is because I grew up in Texas. I grew up a Christian, white, in Texas. I didn't have any Muslim friends, all right? And I'm not trying to say good, bad, or indifferent. I just didn't have them, all right? My introduction to Islam is 9/11, all right? Obviously I'm not saying that's representative of all of Islam, but that was my introduction to it. Nobody talked to me about Islam prior to that. And so I've got a lot of reasons to hate Islam, all right? I have a lot of friends since 9/11 who are dead because they were killed by Muslims. I've got reasons to hate Islam, but I don't hate Islam, all right? In fact, I've got a special place in my heart for Muslims, all right? And it's because I live in a melting pot, all right? When I lived in Virginia, for a period of time, we lived in a townhome, and we shared a wall with a Muslim family, all right? 2 feet of snow, I was out of town. My wife got a baby and 2 other kids, and this guy came out and swept our driveway, shoveled our driveway, 2 feet of snow. Did it on 2 different occasions, would not take any kind of money for it. Wouldn't take any, it was his gift. His kids played with my kids, and they were great neighbors. They were the best neighbors you could have asked for. And so when I hear people talk about hating Muslims, it makes me angry because I've got faces, I've got names that I know and love and care about. I've got their number on my phone. I can call them. I have a relationship. That's not something you get in a multiculturalist society. That's what you get in a melting pot society. Those biases necessarily have to erode, and that's a beautiful thing. And the other piece of it is, as those biases melt off, what we see from a counterterrorism standpoint is the FBI's #1 source for information that disrupts terrorist plots is the Muslim community. There's nothing that remotely comes close. There's no source of intelligence that remotely comes close on counterterrorism operations than the Muslim community. All right? That's a melting pot. All right? That is where people are trying to assimilate. And it's a beautiful thing, and we have to be careful from an American perspective not to let that go because it is incredibly unique. So that's Middle East, that's Europe, that's America. That's the operating environment. So what do we expect from terrorism? Well, a few things. Let's start off with the Islamic State, simply because they've done more in the past few years than anybody else. They've gained territory. They have, basically, they rolled into northern Iraq after we handed over all of our equipment to the Iraqi army. They rolled into northern Iraq, challenged them. The Iraqi army beat feet, as we used to say, running out of there, and left all the equipment. So they're driving around in U.S. Humvees, using U.S. weapons that were left as stay-behinds for the Iraqi army. They have contiguous territory. They have a base of operations where they can move around somewhat with impunity. Obviously, airstrikes tend to make that impunity, to hamper it a little bit, but they have a strong base of operations. they also have engaged in wholesale slaughter. 170,000 people are dead because of the Islamic State. All right, mostly Christians and Shiite Muslims, but 170,000 people are dead. The Obama administration just came out a few weeks ago and declared it a genocide. Sadly, the reason they did that was because they finally got confirmation that legally declaring a genocide would not automatically commit the U.S. to sending troops to deal with the genocide. So as a voting citizen, you can factor that in, that we're okay with declaring genocide once we realize we don't have to do anything about it. All right, that's a very troublesome thing, and you can factor that in however you want. In 2014, the Islamic State surpassed Boko Haram, a Nigerian terrorist organization, as the deadliest terrorist organization on the planet. Interestingly enough, Boko Haram since that time has pledged allegiance to the Islamic State. The U.S. and EU reaction to all this has been pretty anemic. All right, we've basically been limited to airstrikes. The 250,000 deaths in the Syrian civil war aren't enough to earn a ground troop commitment. And really, what would be? You know, I mean, if we're going to be honest, our country is sick of sending soldiers overseas. There's plenty of soldiers. I know plenty of soldiers who are willing to go. All right. But our country politically is not willing to do that. So 250,000 deaths, we're willing to brush that off. It doesn't get a commitment, at least on the order that would be required, 50,000 troops plus, to do something about it. We do special forces raids and stuff like that. You see that in the news every once in a while. But the commitment's been pretty anemic. So what we will continue to see, well, let me back up here. Al-Qaeda, as the world has focused on the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, which was the main threat post 9/11, everybody focusing on the Islamic State has allowed Al-Qaeda to kind of put some salve on its wounds and regrow, which is why the Director of National Intelligence in his 2016 forecast said Al-Qaeda is poised to make some significant gains in 2016. They maintain global strike capability, meaning they've got cells around the world that are ready to strike. And so the difference between Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State really is just in strategy. I mean, they're both buying into the same ideology. Al-Qaeda wants to strike the far evil, the United States, and once the United States collapses, they want to establish a caliphate. Whereas the Islamic State wants to establish the caliphate now and strike whoever's within striking distance. All right, so it's the same ideology. It's just a different strategy. And so in the foreseeable future, what we can expect from terrorism is to see increased attacks on Northern and Western Europe. Northern and Western Europe. Increased because they are admittedly using those migrant flows to infiltrate people in. They are using that multiculturalism to hide out. When the perpetrators of the Brussels attack were finally wrapped up, and the Paris attack as well, when the perpetrator of the Paris attack in November of 2015 was captured last month, he was captured 100 yards from the apartment he had been living in prior. That is what you call a non-permissive law enforcement environment. Okay, it was a neighborhood where cops did not feel like they could go. And so he was able to hide out with relative ease there. So we will continue to see multiple attacks throughout Northern and Eastern Europe, and those attacks will be based out of these ethnic enclaves, all right, because that's the only place to hide out. Really, further down the road, what we're going to see is the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda are going to join forces, all right? Both of them are ideologically, they're twins. ISIS emerged out of Al-Qaeda. Really, the only differences they have are strategy and personalities, basically ego. Nobody wants to let the other guy be in charge of them. So as those people who, with those egos, die or are killed off, we'll see one of those groups subsume the other. I'm not sure which will do what, but one of those groups will subsume the other, and those two will merge. That's going to create a pretty deadly combination because they have global strike capability. They have the regional base. It's a pretty hideous scenario from a counterterrorism perspective. You have to remember that it really the personalities are really the only thing that's keeping them apart. And so when that comes together, and I would predict, it could be sooner than that, but I would say certainly by 2020, 2021, that merge will happen. As pressure comes down on both of them, they'll seek to maximize their resources and join forces again. Just to touch on separatist stuff before we leave Europe altogether, really, if you're looking at separatist stuff, you're looking at Syria and Ukraine, which is strangely the same place you see Russian soldiers who aren't supposed to be there popping up from time to time. All right. Russians have decided to back YPK, which is a Kurdish terrorist group that is seeking to create an autonomous region in northern Iraq and Syria, and so they've decided to do that. The Russian involvement in Syria is really only there because the Russian economy is in tatters. Okay, Russia is basically a large gas station, and gas prices have taken a major dip. All right, so Russian involvement in Syria is meant to give them leverage over the European Union when it comes time for the European Union to vote on sanctions. Okay, Russia can't stem the tide of immigrants, but they can make it worse. They can make Syria howl. They can send refugees into Europe at a vastly increased rate, and Europe can't handle that. And so Russian involvement in Syria is largely just to maintain the ability to have leverage over the EU. In Ukraine, where you have separatist organizations looking to establish autonomous areas in Ukraine, the Russian involvement there is really just biding time. All right, Vladimir Putin engaged in a 2-year rebuilding of the Russian military. Started in 2015, so we're a year into it. What you are looking at now is a game of chicken to see, does the economy in Russia completely collapse, or does a military rebuild happen first? If the economy doesn't collapse, what you will see is a Russian move into Ukraine in 2017. And it's because they finally got the resources behind them to make the move, which obviously has NATO implications and things along those lines. So moving from Europe to the U.S., we have to remember the U.S. is at war. This was the most difficult thing I had to do at the agency as far as getting the word out. Telling people we're at war, reminding people we're at war. If you don't realize you're at war, you don't look for threats. Okay, we're at war. The U.S. is always overdue for an attack. Always. You should never be surprised by a terrorist attack. It will happen. It will happen routinely. You're obviously going to be shocked by it, but you should never be surprised that it would happen. The U.S. is at war with militant Islam, and so we should always be ready for that. And San Bernardino showed us that. But the difference is this is grassroots terrorism. The logistics of conducting a complex attack, a 9/11 style attack on the U.S., is just too much. To cross oceans, to get through all the security structures that we have in place, to conduct a complex attack, it's just too difficult. And so what you see is, instead of trying to do something like 9/11, we will see stuff like San Bernardino, where people use the skill sets, they use the resources that they have at hand, whether that is an AR-15 or whether that is, in the case of the Boston bombers, a pressure cooker that they bought at Macy's. Okay, those guys went to the mall and bought what they needed to conduct the terrorist attack. All right, so these are unsophisticated attacks, but don't ever mistake that for ineffective. These are very effective attacks, but they're not sophisticated, so they're much harder to detect from a security perspective. But we do have tactics. We do have things that we can do to prevent that. All right, our weakness is that we can't secure everything. In a free society, there's just too many soft targets. Their weakness is that they really suck at surveillance. All right, they can't do surveillance very well, and they are really bad at acquisition. All right, every attack worldwide has to go through the same 6-stage cycle. All right, you have to ID the target. All right, you have to conduct pre-operational surveillance. Pre-operational surveillance is when you send out your scrubs to take a look at it and see if it's feasible. All right. Then secondary surveillance, which is when you send out the pros to figure out the information that's actually needed for the attack. Then you plan the attack, you deploy for the attack, and then you conduct the attack. Each stage is going to look different in every attack, but every attack goes through all 6 of those. Terrorists, and more specifically grassroots terrorists that are operating without a support structure are notoriously horrible at pre-operational surveillance. Surveillance is an incredibly difficult thing to do if you have training and you have a team dedicated to it. It's incredibly difficult to do. But that being said, it's nearly impossible to do if you're by yourself and you don't have any training. All right. So by simply deploying counter surveillance, we can really be effective in that. And by counter surveillance, we can mean certainly by hardened areas we're going to have people looking out for people who are casing the joint. All right. But in regards to soft targets, having people who have a mindset that we're at war dramatically changes things. Recognizing that there are people out there who would love to make you a victim makes you that much less likely to become one. All right. For instance, let's see, Hassan Smadi was trying to blow up a Dallas skyscraper. All right. He wanted to do this. I think it was back in 2009. He as somebody who'd studied it, he knew how to build a very effective bomb. He called in all the guys that were in his little cell that he had developed and told them how to do it. They built that bomb perfectly to his specifications. He was unaware that all of his guys were FBI undercover agents. And so they load that sucker up and drove it into Dallas, parked it next to the building that they were going to go. And I have to think, like I would have loved to have been in the surveillance car watching that, because they're sitting there and he keeps trying to dial the number that detonates on the cell phone that's supposed to detonate the bomb, and it doesn't go off. And you know those guys were just sitting there laughing like, man, he's really getting frustrated. But that was the acquisition piece of it. He had reached out to try and do the acquisition piece, and the FBI swooped in. That's a fairly complex attack, though. Khalid al-Daswari was trying to buy chemicals so he could build his own. He could build his own bomb. He was trying to do it all himself. He didn't want to fall into the same trap as Mr. Smadi. So he knew how to build a chemical bomb, so he went and bought those chemicals. The problem is the chemical company knows what you can do with chemicals, and they were aware. And so they reached out to the FBI and said, hey, look, we've got some people making some suspicious purchases. They handed over credit card numbers, and that plot was foiled. All right. Similarly, there was a gun store owner in Killeen, Texas, that helped nab Nasser Abdo, who was trying to conduct the second attack on Fort Hood. All right. And it was just an aware gun store owner, thought stuff looked suspicious, called it in. This is what it looks like when you have citizens who recognize they're at war. Okay? There are people who want to kill you. It's best for you to keep that in mind. And so you deploy counter surveillance, and that counter surveillance from a societal perspective is really that if you see something, say something program. All right. The problem that we're running into now is nobody wants to say anything because they think they're going to be called a racist whenever they call it in. That was, in San Bernardino. All of his neighbors afterwards. Typically when you see some guy that goes up and does some horrible attack, the news people go out and interview his neighbors and they're like, oh, he's a sweet guy, great guy. He's quiet, kept to himself, but really good neighbor. That wasn't the case in San Bernardino at all. Every one of his neighbors said that guy was shady as all get out. And people coming at all times, getting packages delivered. But I didn't want to say anything because I didn't want to be called a racist. That's something we have to overcome as a society if we're going to make headway from a security perspective. Perfect security is a myth. You're not going to be able to stop every terrorist attack. That's the problem with living in a fallen world. But at the same time, we do have tactics that are proven and that we can improve upon to help stop the grassroots terrorists that seek to hit the United States. And they will hit us with greater frequency in the years to come. All right. So that's that. As far as nationalist terrorism or separatist terrorism within the United States, there's a likelihood. I wouldn't call it a certitude or with any sort of certitude, but a likelihood that nationalist terrorism will rear its head again. There's a lot of people who feel disenfranchised right now. There's a lot of people who feel like their vote doesn't count. There's a lot of people who are angry and they feel like the only voice they have is violence. Okay, and so they're going to use that voice to reach out and try and rally people to a revolution or something like that. Let me say without any kind of caveat, that will fail. All right, nobody's going to start a revolution in the United States. People just aren't that committed. They want to know what's going on with Justin Bieber. They don't really care about governmental structures anymore. All right, everybody's laughing, but you can't name 10 presidents. So the point is, there are people out there who we may see acting violently in the next few years. So what do we do about all that? I mean, that's the question that we come to. If that's what Europe, the Middle East is a hot mess, or the Middle East is a dumpster fire. I mean, it's bad. Europe is a hot mess, and the United States, we've kind of got this grassroots terrorism thing that's going to get worse, as we move forward. So what do we do about it? Well, the reality is, for counterterrorism, at the core of every counterterrorism operation is a really kind of ugly question. It's an awkward question of who are you? Who are we? And it sounds cheesy, right? But the reality is, you got to answer that question. Who are you? Like, what are you willing to fight for? What do you believe in? These are awkward questions because, and they sound cheesy because you can't answer them. The vast majority of Americans can't answer that. What are you willing to fight for? What are you willing to put away all of your hopes and dreams and fight for? You can't answer it. Well, or the vast majority of Americans can't. But it becomes really ominous when you realize that the Islamic jihadi already has answered those questions. Okay, he wants a global caliphate. All right. He wants it now. He wants it yesterday. He wants to see women subjugated and made into property, where they don't get an education, they don't drive, they don't go out of the house unless they got a brother or a father with them, where they're stoned because they were a victim of rape. Okay? That's what life under the Islamic State, that's what life under Al-Qaeda looks like. Okay? In no way am I trying to paint every Muslim in that category, because that would be a wholly inaccurate picture. Okay? But when we're talking about Islamic jihadis, that's what it looks like. They want women subjugated to that level. They want homosexuals dead. There is an active practice in Syria of, if somebody is suspected of homosexuality, they are taken to the top of a very tall building and pushed off so that everybody can watch them and everybody can hear the hit. That's what reality under the Islamic State looks like. Okay? They want Christians dead. All right, they're all infidels. In a best case scenario, the younger women would be married off, and I probably should do air quotes on that, married off, and the older women allowed to survive in a subservient way if they pay a tax that would be set by the people over them. The Islamic Jihadi wants, through Sharia law, to govern every aspect of your life to the glory of Allah. All right? He believes in that. He's dedicated to it. He's ready to die for it. He believes that the eternal pleasure that he has coming far outweighs any temporary sacrifice he's willing to make. And that's awkward because, as a nation, what can we say that about? I mean, seriously, what can we say that about? I mean, the Founding Fathers revolted over a tea tax. I mean, it was a little bit more complex than that. I'm sorry. I'm sure Dr. Supratman could get into that. But it was a little bit more complex. But, I mean, I love seeing all the stickers that say, "Don't tread on me." Because I want to say, or what? What are you going to do about it? You know? Because the reality is we are big on words right now, but we are a mile wide and an inch deep. And right now we are distracted from the fight of our lives. People who are wanting to kill us and kill our way of life because we're arguing over who gets to use what restroom. Okay? We're arguing, does socialism work? And I'm not trying to make a statement on either of those things. All right? I'm saying people are trying to kill you. Okay? That's the discrepancy here. Okay? And we've got to remember what the fight is about and not get distracted. Okay? There's arguments you can have as a family, but when people are trying to kill the whole family, you shut up and you get to work. Okay? Eastern Hemisphere, the reality is the entire Eastern Hemisphere of the globe is undergoing dramatic and painful change. It's unavoidable for them. They cannot avoid it at this point. It's an intractable thing. They have to go through it. But it's not unavoidable for us. Because of the blessing of geography, we have a brief window to make some choices. We have a brief window to make some change. And so now is when it has to be done, because that window is shutting. It's in the process of being shut. And then we will go down the exact same path. I lived in Virginia when I was working for the agency. Northern Virginia, at the foot of the Blue Ridge, to my mind, one of the most beautiful places on the planet. I love it. And so as I would head west to my house, I'd look at the Blue Ridge. Sun would be setting behind it. It was just beautiful, and I'll be thinking about all the junk that I had just dealt with at work, all the problems that our nation has, almost inevitably, my mind would go to a quote from Abraham Lincoln. That quote is this: "From whence shall we expect the approach of danger? Shall some transatlantic military giant step the earth and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe and Asia could not by force take a drink from the Ohio River, or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. No, if destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and its finisher. As a nation of free men, we will live forever or die by suicide." And that's what we've got to make a decision on as a nation. The choice is ours, but as a nation, we have to decide what we're willing to fight for. And then we got to shut up, and we actually got to fight it. That's all I got. I thank you for your time, and yeah.